Hello. So I think we're live now. We could get started. Hi, everybody watching from wherever you are, probably at home. My name is Samantha Shokin. I am Manager of Public Programs at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in New York City. I am joined by Dr. R Weintrob and Rokhl Kafrissen. And we're very excited to finally bring this program, Heroines of the Holocaust, to those of you watching. We were supposed to have this as an in-person presentation at the museum a few weeks ago. As you may or may not know, it's Women's History Month, so we were very excited to bring this program to life after many months of planning. But then the situation that we have at hand happened, but we are being flexible and switching to a digital format. And initially we were supposed to go live on Facebook at the very last minute. The Zoom was having technical issues, so now we're doing this as a webinar, and everyone's being very nimble and flexible, which I am very thankful for. So let me introduce our speakers for today. We have Professor Weintrob joining us. She teaches Holocaust Studies, Immigration, and Global Leadership at Wagner College. As founding director of the Wagner College Holocaust Center in Staten Island, Lori has connected local survivors face-to-face with more than 5,000 youth of all faiths in the tri-state area. She is currently editing Eyewitness to History, Documents of the Holocaust, and has published on a range of topics, including Beyond Bystanders, Educational Leadership for a Humane Culture. And today's moderator, our special guest, is Yiddish culture writer Rokhl Kafrissen. Rokhl is a New York-based freelance journalist, cultural critic, and playwright, and author of A Broche, a Yiddish-English gangster ghost romance in 3 acts. She is a tablet columnist on contemporary modern Yiddish arts and culture, and a 29 Laba Fellowship recipient for her play exploring the cultural clash between interwar avant-garde Yiddish theater and modern academia. So thank you, ladies. We're very excited for today's program, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Samantha, and the Museum of Jewish Heritage for inviting me to speak today, and to Rokhl Kafrissen for your insights into Yiddish culture and all of our practice sessions. For those tuned in on Facebook or watching afterwards, please let us know by posting a comment in the chat where you're watching from. And I want to make a special shout out to the Susan Wagner High School students and to the New Ventures high school students in their Holocaust and genocide classes who might be watching. Take a moment to consider, how do we define resistance, particularly during the Holocaust and particularly by women? Consider a few lines from this poem. To smuggle a loaf of bread was to resist. To teach in secret was to resist. To extend a helping hand to others was to resist. In the face of persecution, women and men found the courage to stand their ground, to risk their lives. Yet why, despite such heroism, when we study the Holocaust, can we more often name the perpetrators than the resistors? We see a rise in incidents of anti-Semitism in our own country and around the world. We see a rise in hate, and we realize how fragile our democracy is. We must be vigilant. If we follow the lessons of these women in the resistance, we must be prepared to show compassion and build networks. In the words of the commander of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the highest ranking female commander, Zivia Lubetkin, the mere fact that when everyone was forced to fight for his own life, often at the expense of others, there were still groups of people who practiced and believed in human compassion and mutual aid, who shared whatever they themselves happened to have, was enough to sustain us and retain our human dignity, which was created in the image of God. In my role as founding director of the Wagner College Holocaust Center in Staten Island, New York, I've had the opportunity to hear from many survivors of genocide. Their stories have impacted my understanding of how resistance begins. Decisions of parents, strategies of community and youth leaders, the transition from nonviolent to armed resistance, and relations with non-Jews. And later in this program, I'll have an opportunity to speak about one special Holocaust survivor from Staten Island, Rachel Roth, and her story of smuggling a gun into the ghetto. With my colleague, theater professor Teresa McCarthy, we've explored ways that words of testimony spoken out loud create a greater understanding of key questions such as when did the Holocaust begin and what is resistance, among students of all faiths. Look for examples in this presentation today, although not live and in person until the fall when we reschedule this event. We've brought you little snippets adapted from Anna Deavere Smith's theater work. Groundbreaking work on the once neglected topic of women and the Holocaust by scholars and activists have also inspired me. I headed to Israel to the Ghetto Fighters Museum, Lochamei HaGhettoot, and there, to my astonishment, in their archives, in their cemetery, in their exhibits, they had photos and descriptions of not just 20 or 50 women, but thousands of women who resisted. Women who operated soup kitchens or underground schools, who smuggled food into ghettos and children out and participated in uprising. In my forthcoming book, Eyewitness to History, Documents of the Holocaust, I seek to make resistance and rescue in all its forms at the center of every topic, from the rise of the Nazis to liberation, to hear the voices of Jewish and non-Jewish women as well as men. Several of these stories are already part of an exhibit at Wagner College on rescue and resistance, which I curated with art historian Laura Morwitz, my colleague. We are planning an international conference on heroines of the Holocaust for teachers and scholars at Wagner College in June of 2021, and I hope many of you will be involved. In the talk today, I will focus on Vitka Kempner on the right, among the first in the war to explode, whose bomb exploded a Nazi train in 1942, and Sara Ginaite on the left, who gave one of the first public speeches about heroines of the Holocaust in the forest, in the Rudniki forest. And whether you're watching on Facebook Live or afterwards or in this web seminar, leave a note in the chat if you have a favorite film, play, or book on resistance or rescue. A central question to ask about Sara, Vitka, and all these women in the resistance is what motivated their transformation. To understand Sara, and indeed to understand what was lost in the Holocaust, requires us to spend a moment before the Nazi invasion. What childhood memory would you hold on to? Sara grew up in Kovno, capital of Lithuania, a city of 30 synagogues. She was educated in Lithuanian elementary school and then Catholic and Jewish high schools. She had felt isolated by growing anti-Semitism among Catholic peers in Lithuania. Like her parents, she spoke several languages, including a little bit of French. Her family thought of fleeing from Lithuania as the war was starting to brew, and her sister was studying in Belgium, but they decided they wanted to be surrounded by their family and their family traditions. Sara was particularly close with her father, and she associated him with the holiday of Passover, one of her favorite holidays and one of mine as well. She writes, I remember the beautifully set table, graced by a plate of sweet fruits, honey, bitter herbs. It was my role as the youngest to ask the 4 questions. Then the feast's first course of stuffed fish, herring, and chopped liver would be laid out on the snow-white tablecloth. So Sara's memory of the war, and we find this with many survivors, this image of the white tablecloth, the holiday meal, were one of the things that motivated her and inspired her throughout the war and her survival. And then the war began on September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland and divides it between areas that it will annex, areas where it will put the largest ghettos and later the death camps, and a piece that is taken over by the Soviet Union, which will soon include Lithuania. And Vitka at the moment is actually on the border of Germany, Germany and you can see it here, Germany and Poland, in a small town which is 30% Jewish, although she's also studied in Warsaw. And she will flee to Vilna, and you can see that Sara's experiences in Kovno, she's very nearby to Vitka's experiences in Lithuania. Tragically, the Nazis will, in 1941, invade this area, followed by Einsatzgruppen, and massacres will begin. So during these 2 years, when the ghettos are established in Poland, Lithuania is spared some of that brutality. But by June 22nd, 1941, the Nazi invasion, 3 of Sarah's uncles are killed on just a day or two after the invasion, not by the Nazis, but by their Lithuanian neighbors. It's a very difficult time. Vitka and many refugees flee to Lithuania. And in Lithuania, some of them are fortunate enough to meet a Japanese diplomat named Shiun Sugihara, who, along with his wife Yukiko, helps to smuggle them out, helps to write them visas so they can escape Lithuania. And Lithuania has actually declared this the year of Sugihara. So Sarah and her family are forced to move into the Kovno ghetto in the summer of 1941. And her life begins to change under tremendous hardship, carrying cement, doing hard labor outside, walking outside the ghettos in the morning as part of the labor group. She's beaten up by one of her guards who's Ukrainian. But the worst is one morning when she wakes up and she sees something that will never fade from her memory. She writes, "In whatever direction I looked, I saw a black, slow-moving mass of people. Like a procession of shadows with neither a beginning nor an end, the dark throng of people inched along in the direction of Ninth Fort, surrounded on all sides by armed policemen. That nightmare vision of a column of 10,000 people marching slowly towards death." And so at the age of 17, Sarah writes, "After this great action, I decided to take my fate into my own hands. I completely rejected the way the Nazis had decided to arrange my death." And so her bravery emerges, and she seeks out the leader of the AFO, who names her, much to her great dislike, Sarah the Blonde, because of her strong skills in language and her non-Jewish appearance. And she's working on a farm, having been nursed back to health by her mother. Her father dies early in the days of the ghetto. And she begins to smuggle first food by negotiating with a woman who lives near the farm. And then she's transferred to work at a military hospital. And she takes advantage of this opportunity of working alongside German soldiers. Some of them hide under the beds, rifles, and she finds one. She wraps her find in rags, the short Japanese-made rifle easily fit in a bag lined with twigs. My heart was pounding, she writes, with joy as I got into the truck. It was only when I started walking towards the inspection point at the gate that I began to feel frightened. Slowing down a little, I stepped back hesitantly to let others go ahead. And we see here how the German and Lithuanian guards are checking each and every Jew who walks through on their way back from factories to see if they are smuggling anything, cheese or bread or anything that could be dangerous. And Sarah has a strategy. In the Kovno ghetto, the Jewish police and the Jewish council are still, at this period, welcoming to the underground resistance. And so she takes the risks and she asks the head of the Jewish police to help her. Timidly, she whispers in Yiddish, "Ich bin sehr treif." I am very unkosher. This let him know I was carrying something strictly forbidden. He smacks her across the face and pushes her through the gate, which the Nazi guard must have thought, oh, Jews hitting Jews, this is something, and allowed her to pass through without being frisked, without being checked. And so at the age of 19, she smuggles a gun into the ghetto, and it's just the beginning. Soon she smuggles another gun to other women in the resistance. And one of the interesting things about the women's memoirs about the Holocaust that I found, or in general about resistance memoirs that is not always true of those about the camps, is that there's so many names. They name everyone in their network, all those who help on different missions, and relationships become a critical part of their resistance strategy. Soon, later that year, she marries another resistance leader, Misha Rubinson, and together, a month later, they make a very difficult decision to leave the ghetto and to join the partisans. She leaves behind her mother, Rebecca, and her sister, Alice, perhaps because they have each other. She decides that it's the right thing to do. And again, because of the good relationship with the Kovno policemen, they're able to sneak out in a rented truck and arrive in the forest on December 16th. We'll hear more about her story in The Partisans later in the presentation. So we wanted to just, before I talk about Vitka's story, so much of what motivates the resistance movement in Lithuania are the murders at the Ninth Fort and the murders at Pinar. Like Babi Yar, these are the territories that where Jews are killed before Auschwitz is built and holding Jews. These are the first sites of mass murder. This is the origins of the final solution in the fall of 1941. And so Rokhl and I had talked about how these sites, and of course being there in person is particularly important, and Rokhl is going to share some of her reflections about being in Pinar.
Well, so first of all, I want to say that this is a picture of Fania Bronsovsky, and I got to meet Fania, which was just an incredible experience when I went to Vilnius, Lithuania in 2008 to do the Yiddish program, where Fania was the librarian at the Yiddish Institute there. And so one of the things about going to Pinar that I think is really important to understand, and you really understand it when you go there, is that it's 12 kilometers from the city of Vilnius. So this is not far away, it's not hidden. I mean, it is in the forest, but you really understand that like in a very real way when you go there. Fania, in an interview, she called it, I think, a dacha village. So this is her, this is the, you can see the memorial that they erected, that's sort of at the entrance. But then when you walk into the woods and towards the massacre site, it's just this kind of, it's essentially a pit in the middle of the forest. It was originally built by the Soviets who had controlled Lithuania before that. It was a large pit constructed to hold fuel, which they never used apparently. And then the Germans came and used that. So apparently, as it says here on the memorial, 70,000 people were killed there between 1941 and 1944, as you can see. And Fania became a member of the underground and a member of a partisan group because people understood what was happening. They saw immediately what was happening, the massacres. And she says, what does she say? We were young and the young have no fear, which is an important qualification. But she's still pretty fearless, and she's almost 100 years old now, if you can believe that.
And for women like Sara Ginaite and Vitka, these sites of Pinar, of Ninth Fort, are seared in their memory. And when they would go out on missions, they would say, this is for Pinar, this is for the Ninth Fort. So it motivated them. And it's an important part of understanding how the Holocaust happens in stages, how genocide doesn't just emerge in a single moment, but that we can look at the escalation. And it's also, many people who teach about the Holocaust use some very good books about the perpetrators and their motives, the Einsatzgruppen and the police battalions. And it's also important to look at these sites from the perspectives of those who resisted, because it takes on how did Jews and those who allied with them in the resistance look at the Nazis rather than only seeing it from the Nazi perspective. So Vitka is indeed an extraordinary woman. At the age of 17, she's already accomplished quite a bit. She's the first woman to join a male youth group, Batar. And when the Nazis invade, so we're going back to 1939 invasion, when the World War II breaks out, she immediately rebels. She's already had the experience of studying in Warsaw. She knows how to move around Europe. And she tells her parents that she must leave. They've been gathered by the Nazis in a church. They're going to be expelled from their community. And she says, I can't stand the humiliation. And this becomes her first act of resistance. So she goes to Vilna, and then she doesn't stay in the city, but she goes to Belarus. She's hiding in false papers. And even when the ghetto is created, she doesn't have the right papers to go into the ghetto. But she does become part of a youth group there, a Zionist youth group. And both these stories, I just wanted to put up the map again to show how the Einsatzgruppen are leaving Germany and going into all the different regions that were once occupied by the Soviet Union, that were part of the Soviet Union, including Vilna and Kovno, and how despite this really critical role in the escalation, in fact, in the origins of the final solution, according to the Claims Conference, 95% Americans don't know that the Holocaust even happened in Lithuania, despite the fact that so few Lithuanian Jews survived the war. It really devastated a culture that went back, I believe, to something like the 12th century. But there are young people who recognize what is happening. And at the avant-garde of that is the group Vitka is with, including Ava Kovner. So both Ava Kovner is living in one convent on the outskirts. Vitka is living on another in another convent in hiding, but she's increasingly going on missions, and she has a mission where she has to bring different leaders back and forth into the ghetto. And finally, they hear from somebody who escapes from Ponar. And on New Year's Eve, when the Germans will be distracted, they issue their manifesto that 23-year-old Ava Kovner writes. He says that these massacres are not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic plan. Hitler conspires to kill the Jews of Europe, but the Jews of Lithuania have been picked at the first line. Let us not be led like sheep to slaughter. According to scholars, this is the first call for organized Jewish resistance. The courage demanded of the fighters is captured in the final line, resist to your last breath. His words galvanized Zionist youth leaders and their allies, the communists, to create the United Partisan Front. And this despite tremendous conflict with the head of the Jewish ghetto in Vilna, who tremendously worries about the fears collective reprisal and what will happen, how the Germans will treat them differently if there's a resistance movement in the ghetto. And despite this hardship and in the shadow of these tragedies, in Rich Cohn's book, The Avengers, he talks about the Passover Seder in 1942. And Vitka's dear friend, Ruska Korczak, speaking at the Seder, reflecting on the four questions, says, what is different? We are different. If we fall, we shall fall fighting. Our blood will bring redemption. And just to put this into context, Passover 1942, we know, is also the first Seder that Jews celebrate in Auschwitz. According to Heather June Macadam's book, 999, on the first female Jewish transport to Auschwitz, where 1.1 million Jews will be killed, where 6 million Jews will be, as part of the 6 million Jews who are killed in the Holocaust. Heather has identified from survivors the actual Passover ritual conducted by someone named Berta Berkowitz, number 1048, on her arm with her tattoo. She says, Bertha says, I did this out of respect for my parents. This was my defiance. It was the only thing I was able to do, to whisper the text of the Haggadah and to not eat bread for a week. And Heather writes, exhausted from cleaning swamps, demolishing buildings, clearing snow, carrying manure, digging ditches, most of the 997 girls from Slovakia sank to sleep long before Pesach prayers were finished. Was anyone suffering more than they were at that moment? And indeed, another prisoner, whose number is 1971, Helena Citron, recalled that she said, Auschwitz was like 10 plagues in one day. And so as the Jews are beginning to arrive in Auschwitz, but as so many thousands, tens of thousands have been killed, around Vilna and around Kovno, the Jews begin to organize their weapons. And on the bottom left, you see a homemade bomb that the Jews constructed, putting nails inside a hollowed out piece of wood, and in the center, the place for the explosives and the fuse. And it is this bomb with which Vitka will become the first to smuggle a bomb out of the ghetto herself after scouting for a week to find the perfect location of sabotage so that the Germans won't be identified as a Jewish resistance movement. And she's able to blow up a German ammunition train, killing over 200 German soldiers, according to news reports. And indeed, the Germans do retaliate, and assuming it was a Polish resistor, kill 60 Poles in a nearby town. Vitka's bravery is recorded in a rarely cited testimony from the Eichmann Trial in 1961. And this is what Ava Kovner says about Vitka Kempner. Quote, "In this courtroom, there sits a woman who spent a certain time outside the ghetto with Aryan papers, living as a teacher of Catholic children in a secure place. And she and others like her were asked, were you prepared to return to the ghetto? They were asked by comrades in the underground to leave their place of security in order to be partners in our fate in the war and to sacrifice themselves, with no chance of returning. And through this gate where, according to the announcement, where whoever went through to buy bread or to bring a kilogram of potatoes was shot to death, on her person she transferred explosives and dynamite." And he emphasizes in his testimony that it's not a Polish or Russian resistance movement, but a Jewish woman who, after working 30 miles outside the ghetto, had blown up the first German train in Lithuania at great risk, not only to herself, but for everyone around her. And despite her heroism, I think this testimony is not quoted often enough, overshadowed by other aspects of Ava Kovner's important testimony about the killing of Wittenberg, the leader of the Kovno, of the Vilna ghetto. But her contemporaries noticed her bravery, and a year later, in the wake of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Hirsch Glick, a poet who returns to Vilna, will write this poem on the female partisan that recalls that night and other nights since then. The original night in July of 1942, and then her heroism the following winter. And I've asked a few of my students to sing parts of the song in both Yiddish and English. We'll play just a few verses. And the important thing here is how this is something I do sometimes on the very first day of class to introduce them to the song, because I believe it challenges a lot of our understanding of the Holocaust, even as we can analyze it in its own right. So I will play a little bit from the middle part of the song. And the frost, the English. The quiet night is full of stars, and the frost has strongly burned. Do you remember how I have taught you how to hold a revolver in your hand? Amor de a persona vert, und Hand in Hand verzahnt. Amor de mit zusammen of dem Säules Caravan, a girl of fur coat and beret. She holds a pistol in
watches the enemy's caravan.
So this is a very important remembrance of the acts of the 3,000 Jewish female partisans. And Rokhl, did you want to share some of your thoughts on this?
Well, something to keep in mind as we go a little bit further along is, first of all, that this song it's very interesting. It's a song about using weapons, which is not really a traditional topic for Yiddish folk songs, but obviously this is a war song. And one of the things that Ruth Rubin notes in her collection in which this song appears is that it uses 3 different words for guns. So we have pistoil, nagan, and Halten pistoil, nagan, and ashbayer. And so she says that her informant who sang the song for her mentioned that these were actually regional words, one being German, one Russian, and one Lithuanian, or belonging to the Lithuanian region. I think it's really interesting. There's probably a little bit more to it, that it referred to different kinds of arms because they were using rifles, automatic weapons, and pistols. So there's a lot of levels going on to the vocabulary. And also it's interesting because it's from a man's point of view, and he's taking a little bit of artistic license, but Hirsch Glick wasn't there. He describes it as a man teaching a woman how to use a gun, but as we'll see, actually the women often had to teach themselves how to use these weapons.
Exactly. And it's important to notice that including Yiddish in the Holocaust class, I think this is something that I have only done in the past few years as survivors, and particularly one of the Staten Island survivors, Arthur Spielman, also Brenda Perlman, have really encouraged me to explore the ways in which pre-war Jewish life is captured in language. And I think it's also interesting to note that Hirsch Glick's other poem for the partisan, Zognit Keinmal, which translates as "Never Say You're Walking the Final Road," is sung at many, many Holocaust remembrance events. I think this is much less well known, and there's probably a gender component to that as well. In the ghetto, Vitka is courageous, both in the ghetto and then in the forests. And when the uprising takes place in Vilna, the watchword, Liza Roth, is an homage to another young woman who is killed when she's as a courier trying to alert those in another ghetto to the deportations that are happening. And when another wave of deportation happens in Vilna, and there's an effort to gather up the fighters, actually the Jewish policemen and the council are afraid that there'll be retribution. Her unit is captured, but she figures out how she can just tuck her pistol away and calmly walk away. And she persuades Kovner and others that even though their fight has, not succeeded in the ghetto, that it's time for them to move out into the woods and fight with the partisans. And I think that's, yeah.
I just wanted to add a note in about the threat of retribution, because I think you always have to keep that in mind, the sort of calculations that people were making and how incredibly difficult these decisions were. So they had been in a unit that was led by Yitzhak Wittenberg. And in 1942, the Nazis demanded that he turn himself in, essentially, or they threatened to kill all 20,000 inmates of the Vilna ghetto. And
that was the most tragic part of the Vilna underground, that moment. And I think one of the reasons we can talk more at the end about why some of these stories haven't been heard is that that the resistance fighters themselves did not see, they saw themselves less as heroic and more as not having succeeded in saving so many of their comrades who they were mourning for. And so just a little bit more about Vitka in the woods from an actual monologue where she describes her own experiences, read by one of my students, Ruth Kupperberg.
Finally, we came to the partisans, and it was a forest with nothing, swamps. We slept under the sky 2 months. It was raining and it was cold, and it's what we had at the beginning. I was the commander of the patrol unit, and I was going every day, almost, to look for a way of making some sabotage actions and fighting with the Germans. And then I came back. By night, I was escorting the group for a sabotage act. I was sent to Vilna to make connections with the Communist Party and to make sabotage. Together with Heike and some other boys, we decided to make sabotage in Vilna, so the Germans would be afraid the partisans have come to Vilna. And the aim was to have the girls explode the electric transformers and to have the boys destroy the networks of pipe underground, the essential water utilities in the sewers. So we come, the girl Chaya, and me, and we have some magnetic bombs, and we connected it to the transformers. And that night, 4 transformers were exploded. With the Germans walking down the streets, we hid in the shadows. We set the timer for 4 hours. We knew we had to flee Vilna, but the boys were not come. They were too tired. And sadly, we made it and the boys did not, because they were tired. And we were tired too, but the women were stronger than the men.
So this testimony, this part of Vitka's story, I think really shows her incredible courage, you know, planting mines on electrical transformers, being watched by the German soldiers marching back and forth, and how complicated actions of resistance were. They truly carried with them the risk of death at every turn. And this method of speaking aloud the testimony is something that we've developed over the past 5 years at Wagner College, both in terms of individual monologues and creating theatrical pieces. And there's quite a lot of video on YouTube if anybody would like to see. Rise Up by Shira Stoll is a beautiful intimate look at how the students were studying survivor testimony. And then there's many other clips of the play under its original title, In the Light of One Another and Rise Up. So we can come back to that in the Q&A about just how impactful this was on the students to be doing this work. And then just another image of the Rudnicki Forest, another image of Fania, and another story of the father of one of the second-generation survivors who works with the Wagner College Holocaust Center. Her father witnessed the last female Russian parachutist drop into the Rudnicki Forest. Another example of how women were involved in the underground resistance movements and the partisans. And then to go back to Sara's story briefly, and particularly the speech she gives for Women's History Day in 1944, Sara leaves the ghetto and joins the Death to the Occupiers unit. And one of her first missions is to confiscate food. It's one of the things that partisans had to do. And on her first excursion, the wife of one of the peasants chides her for being involved with the male partisans in this kind of activity. She says, "War is not for women to fight." And Sara replies astutely, "Is the killing of women and children proper work for men?" And Sara is involved, as are other women from the Kovno ghetto, in many rescue operations. Their resistance is not just about fighting the Germans, but also rescuing each other, other Jews. And she writes, "There were 4 women in the Death to the Occupiers detachment when the 11 of us joined the partisans, and later on, women would make up about 15% of the detachment." And here is the rest of her speech.
Our daily life was complicated and unusual. We trekked the winding, slow-bone path alongside the men, usually only brief periods of rest. Nobody taught us how to fight or to perform our duties. We learned by ourselves, not only how to clean and use a gun, but how to conduct ourselves in combat and duty, how to blow up a bridge or a train, how to cut communication lines, how to stand on guard. And all of us, young but fully self-reliant adults, we managed to do all that was required of us. So, on March 8th, to celebrate International Women's Day, all of the women in the unit were given a day of rest. We were not required to do work or be in guard duty, and even the most womanly tasks were done by the men. Some of us wished to appear feminine, so we wore skirts and blouses and put on lipstick. And others wished to dress so as to underline the equality between the men and the women. We wore trousers and jackets and belts. I put on a new pair of pants and a warm brown shirt. I wore 2 belts, one for my pants and the second one for my pistol. On the special celebration on March 8th, I spoke not only of the women in our detachment, but also of the women in the Ghetto and the city's underground movement. I told of Janina, who was a member of the underground resistance movement in the Ghetto and was shot at the 9th Fort. She shared a death row cell with APM member Polina. Among other assignments, Polina risked her life when she smuggled a Jewish child to safety. On the occasion of International Women's Day, many women in our detachment were honored by our commanders and officially thanked for their bravery and valor in combat. My happiest surprise was the receipt of a rifle from Costa, our commander. It was so unexpected, and I was so joyful that I forgot to thank him, and instead I kissed my prize. I was one of the first women in the detachment to receive her own personal rifle.
So there's so many things that I think are interesting about this monologue. The rifle that she kisses is the one you see in this famous picture of her. When she talks about wearing 2 belts, one for her gun and one for her pants, I think there's so much pride. The fact that some women wanted to dress and look equal to men and others wanted to be more feminine. I don't know if you wanted to share any other thoughts, Rokhl,
about women in the units. I actually had something I wanted to add to go back to this Pesach theme and related to how difficult life was for them in the forest. I wanted to share something that I read in a memoir of another partisan, a woman named Faye Schulman, who may be familiar to some people. There's a very iconic image of her in a leopard skin coat, which, by the way, real leopard skin. And she says that she was already part of a Soviet partisan unit, which was not a Jewish unit, and she actually had to hide her Jewishness, which, as you can imagine, was, not easy and a very dangerous proposition. And just by incredible luck, in the fall of 1942, she meets up with one of her brothers, a couple who had been he was much more frum than she was. He had been at yeshiva, but had taken up arms also. And they meet up and he says, listen, I'm going to give you dates for upcoming Yom Tovim. And he gives her the secular date for Pesach. So this is fall 1942. He says, here's the date for Pesach in the next year. So she has the date. And come 1943 Pesach, she keeps it in the Soviet partisan unit. She doesn't tell anybody. She eats potatoes for a week in secret. She has to come up with excuses why she's not eating with the team, because their, meals were pork soup basically and bread. So you can imagine that was not easy. And I just love this line where she's describing keeping Pesach in secret for a week. At the end, she says, "I was glad when Passover was over." So, I always think of her now when I think about Pesach and our obligations, and it's such it can be, kind of a drag, and there's all these obligations, and I think about Faye in the forest eating her potatoes, and I feel very, I don't know, it really fills me with courage.
Yeah, and Passover 1944, that was likely that she was in the forest.
43.
43? Oh, yeah. So that was early, yeah. So, wow, 43 Passover. So that was even between the two uprisings, or actually, no, that was the same Passover of the uprising.
The Warsaw.
Yeah. So yeah, she's her work also as a partisan, as a photographer, in documenting the atrocities were tremendous. So I just want to wrap up this section, and I have one last video to share. The secret of the movement's strength, to go back to Zivia, who will be the subject of an entire future talk, if not several talks, was again how she felt that it was the community of people that cares about each other, that it's not an individual. She says it's not an individual, a Mordechai or a Zivia or a Yitzchak, or a Chaya. It's the community that care about each other and share ideas and values in common that made it possible for each of us to do what he or she did. The Jewish people stood the test. And some of that does have to do with the dream of moving to what will become Israel, to Palestine. Some of it has to do with memories of the holidays, the passion to fight the Nazis, to stand up against anti-Semitism and hate, and to mobilize each other. And before we end, I just want to make 2 points about that this talk and all the work that different scholars and others are doing around the topic of resistance. There's a new movie coming out that I believe in many ways it's going back to the original goal of the State of Israel in founding Yom HaShoah. The original name was Yom HaShoah v'Hagevurah, Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Day. And I believe the kind of speeches like Sarah gives in the forest, where she remembers the women who were killed at Ninth Fort on the front lines fighting against the Nazis, are a very important group to remember, as well as the righteous Gentiles. And in doing this work, did you want to add something before I talk about Rachel?
Yeah, I just wanted to say to the people who are listening at home, I'm curious if you want to type in if you have any particular ways that you observe Yom HaShoah, or there are people that you remember on that day. We'd love to hear about that.
And I just want to end with one more short video, and this one is about Rachel Roth, one of the survivors that I've worked closely with. She's spoken at many schools on Staten Island, but also around in South Africa, in Israel, around the world. And she has a wonderful and very important memoir, Here There Is No Why, about her time in Majdanek, Auschwitz, and Warsaw. And we put together a small tribute to her, which I would like to play.
Ghetto, the underground organization said there is no camp, there is no camp, there is death camp. We have to do something. We have to do something. So we decided we have to prepare for a fight with Germany. We have to do something.
There was a community of people who cared about each other, that shared ideas and values in common, made it possible for each of us to do what he or she did. This was the source of our strength.
So I told him, I told him I want to help also. He said, no, you are a girl, you don't know, you are not, they will catch you, they will kill you. And I put the gun I had high shoes. And then somebody gave me 2 packages. They told me to put this in the coat, on my on here, and the dress and in the coat. And then after the work was finished, I came to the gate. The German checked me, and he found the butter and bread, and he smacked me, but he didn't find the gun.
Why is it that we only learn the names of the perpetrators? Eichmann, Kempner, Hirsch, but not those who resisted. Say her name. Sylvia Kempner. Sylvia Kempner.
I thank Maria Rosolo of Rome Pictures for helping me put that together. And so now we have, I'm sorry, just about 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much, Lori and Rokhl. That was so beautiful and touching. And a lot of people are writing in saying, thank you so much for the presentation, that they didn't know about these brave women. They so appreciate this informative information. I guess as people write in with questions of their own, I'll start. I'm curious about your students. What were their experiences like? How did they take this information? Was it new to them? What were their reactions?
So studying both with the survivors and particularly the stories of the women resistors, because now there's a whole class on Zivia, they really find it fascinating. I mean, I show them the film Defiance, and there's a great scene in that film where the little boy looks up at one of the Bielski brothers giving a speech, and he says, I didn't know, that guy's a Jew, right? So this idea of heroism, to return that theme to the study of the Holocaust, I think is really interesting. When my students have done this play at synagogues, one of the first things the Jewish community members ask is, how do non-Jews feel about learning these stories about becoming survivors in Auschwitz? And the students' responses are very touching, that they feel the passion, they feel the courage of the survivors who stood up. And the method of acting that particularly the first few groups did, where they learned the accents and the breathing. I had one student, Jessica, who said that she felt like she knew the survivor better than her own father because she had never stopped to listen to his breathing. And she had to do that to learn by heart the testimony. They each picked 2 to 3 minute monologues. And I actually have been amazed myself when we first started 5 years ago, that the students are so good at picking out the climactic moments, or whatever moment they pick suddenly becomes the moment that is so compelling, whether it's a childhood memory of, knocking over a bowl of cholent while playing soccer, whether it's standing at a hanging in Medonic, as Rachel Roth does, and keeping women's spirits up by inviting them to her Shabbat table, at least in illusion, and that becomes, a kind of defiance. So yeah, the students are very, I've been amazed how touched they are and how much the dynamic between the different generations is so powerful.
Yeah, and that was really apparent even through the video of that one student. She looks like an aspiring actress, the one who did the monologue of Zivia, I think it was.
Well, Ruth did Vitka, and then Joelle did Sarah. And actually, one of the things about Wagner College is there's a lot of opportunities to teach interdisciplinary, but also there's a big theater program, a wonderful, I think it was ranked by Princeton Review first in the country for the passion of the faculty and the students. And so there's a lot of opportunity to take advantage of theater students, but also we'll in a freshman class, we'll get students from all different backgrounds. So there's a cross section. And in terms of the play, we were able to get a grant to write original music. So there's a song as well. So there's lots of material for future webinars.
Yes, absolutely. Lori, can you do me a favor and exit out of your screen so we can see you close up?
Sure.
Because right now the PowerPoint is taking up the whole screen there. Thanks. And we have a question from Joyce Stern asking for some details about the upcoming international conference that was scheduled for June. Do you know anything about that?
2021. So we're going to send out a call for papers as soon as we get past this. We would have sent it out immediately, but we're going to hold off until we see what's happening with COVID. And then probably I'm going to guess something like in July, the call for papers will go out, with paper proposals due in September of this year. So there's time.
Great. Let's see here. I'm scrolling through all of the comments that are coming in.
And please write a lot of comments, really.
There are tons here. We have like around 100 people tuning into this webinar. Here's a comment from Edward Eisenmesser, who says, I always remember my great-grandfather and great-grandmother. Although both are deceased, I had the privilege of being raised by my great-grandmother. Remembering the stories she used to tell me, surviving the Holocaust brings chills to my body. My great-grandfather fought in the war and was one of the most important doctors that helped hundreds of sick and injured soldiers. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Well, this was really, really wonderful. I can't stress that enough. Thank you for being so flexible with all the technical difficulties that we were having at the beginning. People are saying,
you can reach me through my Facebook page, through the email at Wagner College, and I'm sure Rokhl has an email as well. And we're going to continue to have the dialogue. And just to think about, the Claims Conference has said about how many people can't identify Auschwitz, but just to think 95% of those surveys can't identify the Einsatz group in Lithuania. And it's such a critical turning point in the Holocaust. And again, to remember that hate happens in stages, and it's up to individuals to make these courageous decisions.
And if there's any other information out there that people want to access, either of your work, your research, or Rokhl, your writing, where can they look out for it?
Well, there's the Wagner College Holocaust Center, has its own webpage. It has a YouTube on Wagner College. There's SILive.com, has 15 short films that won a New York Emmy. I worked with one of their videographers to create a documentary called Where Life Leads You. And emailing, I'd be happy to hear some feedback. The book is an ongoing project, and there's other things that I'm collaborating on. And so any kind of interest and excitement, and I'm happy to mentor other people who are working on this in this area. I think that there's, with 30,000 resistors and at least 3,000 women, we have a lot of work ahead of us. And please keep demanding more, because their lessons of mutual aid, of compassion, of bravery are so inspiring.
Rokhl, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to say, I wrote about Faye Schulman last year for Tablet. So if you want to go to Tablet and look up A Partisan's Passover, you can read a little bit more about her over there.
Yeah, and we have a program in the fall at the Museum of Jewish Heritage.
Right, exactly. So for those of you who don't know, we had initially scheduled this program in person at the museum, actually the week of International Women's Day, but due to COVID, everything is sort of pushed back, postponed, up in the air. But we would love to schedule this for a later date in the fall. We actually got a couple more questions. So this one comes from Rachel Roth. It's not a question so much as a comment. She says, you should note the similarity between the war and COVID, mass information and not knowing what to do, who is telling the real truth, where to go, where to run, confusion everywhere, and fear. Do you want to speak to that?
Rokhl, do you want to go first, or you want me?
Well, I would say that she brings up a good point, which is that in times like this, especially when there is confusion and the government doesn't seem to be doing as much as it could be, that we are relying on each other so much, and that it is important to look at these other examples of ways that people aided each other and in times of danger. And right now, like if I go and I help somebody, I could be putting myself in danger. And I can't believe the bravery of our healthcare workers who are putting themselves, on the front lines, as it were. So I would definitely take encouragement from that, from seeing examples of people taking care of each other at great risk.
I mean, this is a difficult moment of anxiety, and it makes democracy even more fragile when we go through these experiences. There's quite a lot of political scientists writing about their concern that this could take a bad turn politically. And so, yeah, I mean, one thing I think that's most inspiring is to fall back on these networks of mutual aid and solidarity, and to help each other, and to make sure you're not alone could be something that could really help you. And then again, to just be inspired by how many risks the survivors themselves took during the war. So there's so many lessons. It's not uncommon when a survivor will speak at a school that young people will connect to that story for so many different reasons. And we do see other forms of prejudice coming, connected to COVID, other forms of insecurity. So I do think it's valuable. And when Holocaust survivors give us their opinion, like Rachel Roth just did, that I think is itself empowering to me. When I know that somebody who's 95 years old and survived the Holocaust is speaking out. I just also want to mention that Rachel Roth did a beautiful video with Yad Vashem on the last Passover in the Warsaw Ghetto. So as you're getting ready for Passover, it's a very inspiring thing to watch as well.
Thanks so much, Lori. We have time for just a couple more questions. 2 people wrote in, and then we have to close it out. So I will read both of them in succession, and you can try to answer them in the limited time we have left. So this one's from Mitchell Bloomer. He asks, do you have any favorite stories of Jewish women resistance fighters with the partisans in Yugoslavia? That's the one. And then this next question is from an anonymous attendee. Would you mind explaining more about the 9th Fort?
Okay. Rokhl, or want me to go? In terms of Yugoslavia, I think I actually was very tempted to bring in some resistance fighters from Greece. Each country has its own story, and I really thought there was something beautiful about just focusing on Lithuania, because it's so often overlooked, and yet again a critical piece of the puzzle of how does the final solution happen and where does resistance begin, to really basic critical conversation themes for the Holocaust itself and understanding the meaning of the Holocaust. So I would have to really brush up on my partisans in Yugoslavia, but I want to thank you for asking, because I just really want to encourage people to write about the partisans in all these different countries. And it reminds me to say that the Jewish Partisan Educational Foundation has a really good handout on women in the partisans. There's a video. I know it does include Sarah Fortis in Greece. I believe it might include one of the partisans from Yugoslavia. So their website is a good place to go, as well as the Museum of Jewish Heritage and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And if you wanted to email me, I'd be happy to dig, because I do think that if there's really 3,000 women partisans, it might be interesting to try to say, like, who are the highest ranking, who are the leaders, just to give a sense of, which ones should we be teaching, who has the most compelling stories, who left testimony behind that deserves to be read. And there are some good books that have come out with a lot of women's testimony, which is not to say we shouldn't remember the male partisans, very important, but that's a separate topic of conversation.
Great. And okay, well, if you guys don't have anything else to add, I think we can close it out now. Thank you once again, R Weintrob and Rokhl Kafrissen, for this wonderful presentation. I encourage all of our viewers to get in touch. We have recorded this webinar and we'll be posting it to social media later, so those who missed it this time around can catch it later. And keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars and online lectures and digital public programs, because we're just getting started in this new platform. So we're very excited. Thank you guys again.
Thank you again to the Museum of Jewish Heritage and to Samantha and Rokhl for your help with this project.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.